In 6th grade, I was pretty popular, with plenty of friends from both genders, and everything seemed fine. But then, something strange happened. My best friend was Grace Smith. We did everything together: shopping, movies, hanging out at friends' houses. It might sound odd to some that a girl was my best friend, but we just clicked. People even joked about us getting married one day, and for a while, I thought it could happen too. Then, out of nowhere, she started pulling away from me. It crushed me. I had no idea what I'd do without her. That's when I started distancing myself from everything. If Grace wasn't there to cheer me on, what was the point of continuing with sports? She made them fun. Whenever we were close, she never missed a game, always there as my biggest supporter. Without her, my life felt empty. I noticed that even though I was good at sports, something didn't feel right anymore. I think it was because with Grace, sports were just one part of the fun. We'd spend time at her house chatting, playing with her dolls, and doing other things we never did at mine. I remember even playing dress-up with her more than once. Maybe I should rewind and start from the beginning. How about we go back to when Grace and I first met? It was in 3rd grade when Grace and her family moved into town, just before Halloween, I think. Actually, no, it was just before that. It was actually a few days before Halloween. I remember because that year, Mom wanted me to dress up as a clown. I had hoped to be a cowboy or a vampire, but after she put so much effort into making the costume, I didn't want to disappoint her. Anyway, back to the story. Grace had just moved in before Halloween, and I was curious what she was going to dress up as. I've always been interested in how others celebrate, even if I didn't know them well. In hindsight, I think I was just trying to figure out where I fit in. I don't know if this is the case at other schools, but at mine, when you were new, it felt like you were treated like an outcast. But that didn't bother me. I liked who I liked, and I had a feeling I'd get along with Grace. So, I decided to approach her, and the easiest conversation starter was to ask about her Halloween costume. "Hi, I'm Keith," I said. "Hi, I'm Grace," she replied. "So, what are you going to be for Halloween?" I asked. I'm not sure yet. My mom wants me to be a fairy, but I'd rather be a cowboy," she said. "A cowboy?" I asked, confused. She looked a little frustrated and then said, "Why do I have to be a cowgirl? Why can't I be a cowboy? I want to look like someone cool, like Jesse James or Billy the Kid. Name one famous cowgirl." "Annie Oakley," I answered. Her face turned angry, and then she kicked me and ran behind a big oak tree. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran over and kicked her back. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, scowling. "Well, you kicked me first." I shot back. "So?" she said. "I'm a girl." "Well, you want to dress like a cowboy, and I have no problem kicking a cowboy," I said. She seemed to relax a bit and gave a half giggle, half snort that made me laugh too. We stood there for a moment, and I scrambled for something to say to break the silence. The best I could come up with was, "Anyway, it's not like I kicked you hard." That made her giggle more, and she gave me a look that I'd come to recognize in the years to come. Before long, the bell rang, signaling that lunch was over, and we reluctantly headed back to class. In class, Grace was seated across the room, so we didn't get a chance to talk again until the last recess of the day. When recess finally came, I looked around for Grace, but she was inside with the teacher. Later, I found out that the teacher was trying to figure out how well she was keeping up with the lessons. After school, I headed to the public bus stop near the school. My parents were bus drivers, and I knew most of the drivers in the city, so they were comfortable with me taking the city bus home. Plus, I had a free bus pass. Just as I was about to reach the stop, I saw Grace in a car with what I assumed was her mom. Grace waved me over. "Hey Grace, what's up?" I asked. "My mom wants to know if you need a ride home," she said. I usually take the bus, but a ride would be great. I replied. Sure, hop in, Mrs. Smith said. As we drove, I told Grace about the best houses to hit for candy, and they dropped me off at my front door. I waved goodbye and went inside to start planning my Halloween route for the next day. The next day at school, I saw Grace on the playground, looking a little down. I asked what was wrong, and she explained that her parents were having a party and wouldn't be able to take her trick-or-treating, so she was stuck at the party. Why don't you come with me? I offered. My parents won't mind, and I'm sure your mom knows where I live. Do you really think I could? She asked, a little hopeful. Yeah, why not? I said. She smiled for the rest of the day, hoping both our parents would agree. After school, we met up with her mom, and as we were getting in the car, Grace turned to her mom and asked, "Do you think it's okay if I go trick-or-treating with Keith and his parents?" Her mom paused for a moment before answering, "As long as it's okay with Keith's parents and you're home by 10, I'm fine with it." "But Mom," Grace protested. "That only gives us enough time to go out and come back. I want to go through my candy and trade my bad stuff for the good stuff." "Hey!" I protested, and Grace giggled. "Why don't we ask if Keith can stay the night at our place?" Mrs. Smith suggested. "Really, Mom?" "I don't see why not," Mrs. Smith said. So, we headed to Grace's house first. I called my mom from there to ask her two things: if I could have a friend over for Halloween, and if I could spend the night at Grace's afterward. My mom asked to speak with Grace's mom, and they worked it out. I was thrilled. I'd get to spend the night with my friend, and since tomorrow was Saturday, we'd probably hang out all day too. To save time, Grace's mom suggested she grab her costume and change at my house. Grace paused for a moment, a familiar mischievous look crossing her face, but before her mom could say anything, Grace grabbed me by the arm and dashed to her room. With her quick pace, it took only a few seconds to get there. Some of you might think I'm exaggerating when I complain, but her room was on the opposite side of the house, and on the second floor. Inside her room, I saw a fairy costume laid out on her bed and laughed, thinking that was what she planned to wear. She picked it up, handed it to me, and said, "Are you crazy? You'll wear this before I do." I was a little flustered as she giggled and rummaged around the room. She pulled a paper bag from under the bed, opened it for me to peek inside, and I saw what looked like a cowboy costume, pale tan with some leather and a shiny detail. She grabbed the fairy costume back from me and stuffed it into the bag. "We'll get rid of this at your house," she said, and off we went, back across the house to the first floor. At my place, my mom hurried me into the bathroom. She'd made my clown costume by hand, and this year, she insisted on making the entire thing herself, no wig included. Once in the bathroom, she wrapped a cape around my neck, the one she usually used for haircuts, and had me kneel by the tub while she turned on the water. I'm not sure how she did it, but it involved several Kool-Aid packets in different colors and the shower sprayer. After that, we went to her room where she sat me down at the vanity and started putting curlers in my hair, saying it would make it look like a clown wig. After 15 minutes of me complaining about how tight the curlers were, Grace turned on the hairdryer and held it over me. Mom said she needed to help Grace get ready and would be back in 20 minutes. After about 25 minutes of staring at the clock, Mom came in, followed by Grace, who was now dressed in her cowboy outfit. Seeing her reminded me of our first conversation and I started giggling. Grace looked at me and said, "Well, howdy, Pilgrim," in a deep voice, making me laugh even more. Mom turned off the dryer and started taking out the curlers, and Grace gathered them into a bowl on the vanity. Then, Mom pulled out a strange comb with long, spaced-out teeth and teased my hair to make the curls stand up. Once she was done, she grabbed some white makeup and asked Grace to fetch my clown costume from the bed. Grace came back with a puzzled look and whispered something to Mom, who then headed to my room with her. I followed them and saw my costume had a large wet spot in the middle. Apparently, my dog Curly, a golden cocker spaniel I'd just gotten for my birthday, had peed all over it. Mom looked upset. There was no way we could wash and dry it in time. Grace, trying to help, giggled and mentioned that she had a spare costume in her bag. Mom looked at her, and they went to grab it. When they came back, my mom laughed. "Well, it's a costume," she said. "No way!" I protested, waving my arms as though to push the costume away from me. "Come on! I'm going as a cowboy, so why can't you go as a fairy?" Grace said. "I don't want to be a fairy. Can't we just throw it in the dryer and wash it later?" I asked, trying to reason with them. "Nope, it'll stink way too much. Either you go as a fairy, or you don't get to go trick-or-treating," Mom insisted. "Nah. That's not an option," Grace exclaimed firmly. She took me by the arm and led me to the corner. "Please," she pleaded. "I really want to go trick-or-treating tonight. I promise nothing will happen to you. Please." I'm not sure how long it took for me to give in. It was probably just a few minutes, but Grace acted like it took hours to convince me. After agreeing, my mom helped me into what had now become my fairy costume. The bag contained a full outfit, and luckily, Grace was roughly my size, though I think she was a little taller than me at that point. The costume included what looked like a bathing suit covered in silver sequins, a pair of wings made of iridescent fabric, white tights, a little top Grace explained was for young girls who didn't need bras yet, and shiny white shoes. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I wasn't nearly as reluctant as most boys would have been. So, here I was, a multicolored, curly-haired fairy. Sure, it was the 80s, but even then, I don't think this was considered normal. With my costume on, my mom took me into her room to do my makeup, not clown makeup, but real makeup, with lipstick and everything. By the time she finished, it was around 6 p.m. The sun had set an hour earlier, and it was the perfect time to start having some real fun. As we headed outside, I showed Grace my map and pointed out where we should begin. But Mom had a different plan. "Okay, you two," Mom called. "Get in the car." "But Mom, I made my map." Plus, we always make fun of those parents who drive their kids around for trick-or-treating. "It's so lame," I protested. "Don't worry. I thought we'd go trick-or-treating at Gold Run." "Wow, really, Mom? That sounds awesome. But what about Grace's mom? Shouldn't you check with her?" I asked. "Don't worry, sweetie, I already talked to Grace's mom." "Cool!" I exclaimed, now just needing to tell Grace about Gold Run. "It's a subdivision in the foothills," I explained. "Lots of rich people live there in huge houses, but they're close together, like a regular neighborhood. You can fill a whole bag in about an hour and a half. The only problem is it takes 30 minutes to get there, so get in the car already," Mom said. Once in the car, we noticed Mom had brought extra bags for us, so we could make multiple rounds. Trick-or-treating was always fun, but this year felt different. It had a mix of excitement and hesitation since I was dressed as a fairy. At the first house, we rang the doorbell, and an elderly woman answered. Grace and I said, "Trick or treat," and the woman looked at me and said, "What a beautiful young girl. I love your costume, sweetie." I blushed and thanked her, causing Grace to giggle. The woman gave her a puzzled look, then handed us candy. As we walked back to my mom, Grace made sure to tell her everything that happened. Mom decided I should curtsy like a proper young girl whenever someone said something like that, and she showed me how. During the first round of houses, I did a lot of curtsying. I lost count after hearing at least 50 different variations of "what a pretty costume," or "you look like an angel from heaven," and my personal favorite, "Hi, darling, you look like such a proper young lady," even though I was in a very skimpy outfit with multicolored hair. No matter what they said, Grace made sure I always remembered to curtsy by poking me in the ribs with her elbow or, if she could, her gun. The first round was strange, but by the second, I started having a lot of fun. I don't remember this, but my mom claims that between houses, I was dancing and twirling around like I was really getting into the role. But I honestly don't remember that. After finishing trick-or-treating and somehow making 3 trips back to the car, we started heading home. But instead of taking me home to wash out my hair and change, Mom seemed to be heading straight to Grace's. "Mom, are we going home first?" I asked. "We could, but since you two wanted to do a 3rd round of the neighborhood, it's getting pretty close to Grace's curfew, and if we went by our house, it would make her late," Mom explained. "I can't be late." "At least if you want me to leave the house again," Grace said. That's when I started feeling nervous and flushed. Grace, sitting beside me in the back, scooted closer and wrapped her arm around me to comfort me. As we drove down Grace's street, I noticed a lot of cars parked along the road, and I secretly hoped there was another party nearby. Unfortunately, my luck didn't improve. Not only had Grace's parents invited all the neighbors, kind of a neighborhood meet and greet, but there were also business associates and friends. After getting out of the car, I ran over to the side and kissed my mom goodbye through the window. Grace walked toward the house, and I quickly found a bush by the door to hide behind. Grace knocked on the door, but couldn't reach her keys at the bottom of the bag with all her clothes. Her mom opened the door, looked around, saw Grace's costume, and said, "I knew you were going to do that." Then she asked, "Where's Keith?" "Well, there was an accident with his clown costume, and he's a bit embarrassed about what he ended up wearing," Grace explained. "Oh, come on, Keith," Mrs. Smith chuckled. "It can't be that bad." I took that as my cue to come out from behind the bush. With 3 large bags full of candy, I stepped out, and I could see Mrs. Smith's eyes widen in surprise, then shrink slightly as she started giggling. I tried to make a quick escape back to the bush, but Grace had already dropped her bags inside and managed to grab me, pulling me into the house. I was frozen with fear, and the attention was overwhelming. With about 70 people at the party, there were plenty of comments like, "You're so adorable," and "Look at her cute costume." The worst moment came when someone asked, "What's your name, darling?" and I froze. What was I supposed to say? I certainly couldn't tell them my name was Keith. Luckily, Grace noticed my hesitation and quickly replied, "Her name's Amanda," then whispered, "She's shy, especially in her costume." The lady nodded and gave me a warm smile. I felt like I might die from embarrassment. If Grace hadn't caught my slip-up, I was sure everyone would have started teasing me and calling me a freak or worse, and I'd be kicked out. But luckily, Grace had my back. From that moment on, we formed a bond that ensured we'd always look out for each other. Around 11 p.m., about an hour after we arrived, Grace's mom looked at me and asked if I had brought a change of clothes. I explained that we didn't have time to go back home without being late. Mrs. Smith thought for a moment, then asked what I would wear to bed, knowing the costume wouldn't be comfortable for sleeping. Then, she had an idea. "I know! Since you're already dressed like a little angel," Mrs. Smith began, but Grace quickly interrupted with, "Fairy," followed by a giggle. "Well, as I was saying," Mrs. Smith continued, "why don't you just wear one of Grace's nightgowns? That way you'll feel comfortable, and you can sleep on Grace's trundle bed." I stammered. Grace interrupted, "Come on, it's just for the night, and we can talk and stuff." "No talking, no horseplay. You two need to sleep, it's been a long night," Mrs. Smith said. Grace giggled and looked at me. After what Grace swears was hours of persuasion, though it was probably only about 30 seconds, I gave in and followed her to the dresser, where she handed me some clothes. I started heading for the bathroom, with Grace saying she would help me remove my makeup. After washing our faces, she left to change out of her costume, leaving me alone to change. While I was relieved to no longer be in the skimpy costume, the nightgown was so light and airy that it made me feel a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before. It was comfortable, though the lace and flowered bows all over it made me feel a little awkward. I hesitated coming out of the bathroom, but knowing Grace was there made it easier. I glanced over at Grace's bed, where the trundle was set up, and saw that she was already in bed. Mrs. Smith came over, kissed both of us goodnight, and turned off the lights as she left. Though we had planned to stay up all night talking, we were both exhausted. I was especially relieved that all the attention had finally died down. When I woke up, I found a small paper bag with my name on it next to me. I later learned that my mom had stopped by after we went to bed, but before the party ended to leave me a change of clothes for the morning. I stayed in bed for a while, waiting for Grace to wake up before doing anything. Around 20 minutes later, Grace woke up, and I told her about the bag with my clothes in it. We spent some time chatting and laughing about the night before, deciding to stay in our pajamas for a bit longer. As we were talking, Mrs. Smith called from the bottom of the stairs that breakfast was ready. Grace and I raced to see who could get there first, and, of course, Grace won. At breakfast, I met Grace's dad and her 6-year-old sister, Ava, who had stayed at a friend's house the night before and went to a different elementary school than us. After breakfast, we headed upstairs. I showered first, then got dressed. While Grace showered, I wandered around her room, amazed by how much stuff she had: dolls, stuffed animals, even her own computer, and a small TV. When she finished and was dressed, we both went outside to play in the backyard. There was a girls' playhouse and a small jungle gym, which would later provide us with hours of fun. We spent most of the day in the playhouse, trading our candy bounty from the night before and making plans about how much we'd eat each day. We woke up around 10 a.m., and by 4 p.m., I had to head home because my parents and I were going out to dinner with my aunt and uncle that evening. From that day on, Grace and I became best friends, and while Grace and Amanda were just as close, later on, Heather would be introduced and become one of our best friends as well. But Amanda remained our little secret.